But I mean, that it was a very silly example, but it's that mentality, that mindset shift, right? Of thinking like, look at this thing that I'm, sitting in front of. What can go wrong? And you start playing those things out in your head, and it's like, yeah, somebody could do that. And then you ask the question,
Things.
yes, yes, exactly. But and then you start asking yourself, like, well, what can we do about it?
Welcome to the Elephant in AppSec, the podcast to explore, challenge, and boldly face the AppSec elephants in the room. I'm Alexandra, your host, joined by my amazing co-host Tristan, a former security engineer and co-founder of Escape. Today, we are excited to be joined by an amazing guest, Derek Fisher. Derek is a cybersecurity leader, a speaker on various security topics, and the author of the famous The Application Security Handbook. Having been a developer before shifting to application security more than a decade ago, Derek has had a unique opportunity to see the industry from the perspective of someone who builds the software that needs to be secured. Lately, he's been working on developing a threat modeling course, and that's why we are very excited to ask him tough questions on this topic today. Want to know whether threat modeling is the future of cybersecurity or just another buzzword? Join us in the conversation. Hi, Derek. So we're very excited to have you today with us. So I think in the industry, we hear more and more about the importance of threat modeling, and I think that's the topic where we wanted to challenge you today a little bit. So welcome to our podcast. I think first maybe we can set the stage, with a real world example. And as some of our listeners may have heard, last September, I think both MGM Resource and Caesars Entertainment, big, large Las Vegas casinos, they experienced a large cyber attack. So it was all over social media. So I think MGM customers, they were not being able to make credit card transactions, obtain money from cash machines. I think the systems were completely shut down. And I think what's even more impressive, it was estimated that around 100 million loss incurred by MGM Resources as a result. So it's quite costly. And I think, in your opinion, do you think it's something that could have been prevented if they would have implemented good threat modeling practices on their side?
Yeah, and it's sort of first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast, and I really appreciate the time to talk about this. But yeah, so I actually was out there for Black Hat right before this happened, and so obviously when big security conferences occur and then there's a cyber attack, like a lot of people point to the conference and say, hey, somebody there was just kind of fooling around, but it turned out that it was much deeper than that. And to your point, it was rather costly for MGM. There was ranges of 80 million up to 100 million or more. There was obviously a lot of operational disruptions with the slot machines and as you mentioned, credit card access, and people weren't able to get into their rooms and things like that. There was a total of about a day and a half, 2 days of total outage. And you can think about what that really means in a dollar and cents perspective. Like we both said, I mean, this was pretty costly just in a short period of time. How much money was lost, and a lot of that's in the operational cost. And when I'm teaching threat modeling to students, I often cite like Amazon. Amazon being a big online retailer, if they have an availability issue and they go offline, even for a period of time, it could be an hour. That's a huge revenue hit, for a company like Amazon. And I'm tying all this back to threat modeling. I promise I'll get there, but the not just the dollar and cents impact of this, but a lot of people were inconvenienced. There's a short-term impact of like, hey, we're not bringing in revenue for this X amount of hours, but there's the long-term impact of the reputational damage, and not just that, but there's longer-term cost of like, now we need to hire additional security individuals. Now we need to look at compliance-related frameworks that we need to implement, and so there's a long tail of additional costs that aren't really baked into that initial breach. So, and I want to make sure I caveat all this with the fact that like MGM, it's not like the MGM International Resorts International. Just to be clear, it's not that they didn't have a security team. Like they have a security team, they have security folks. And I'm sure for all of us that work in the security industry, we know that usually we're one crisis away from or one vulnerability away from a total disaster. And so it's a case of being ever vigilant. So I don't want to sling mud at MGM. I'm sure that they had everything in place that they thought was appropriate to try to thwart this. But when you tie it back into threat modeling, it really comes down to understanding, one of the easiest way to think about threat modeling is, what do we have? What are our assets? What can go wrong? And what are we going to do about it? And, for MGM, asking those simple questions of, what happens if we're offline for, 4 hours, 12 hours, 36 hours, a week? What happens to our payment systems? What happens to our clients if they can't get into their rooms? Asking those questions and saying, okay, what are we going to do about it? Those are all, those are simple questions that somebody can ask themselves. And I'm sure that they did, right? And again, I'm not saying that they didn't. I had never worked at MGM Resorts International. I don't know, anybody that
Have you
works
been
there.
there?
I've
Have you
been
been to
there.
the?
I have
Yeah.
been there, but I don't know their security team. I'm sure that they, are doing the best they can. But and a lot of times, it comes down to a cost balance. What is our risk of this occurring, and what is it going to cost us to do something about it right now, right? And there's a lot of different ways to kind of balance that to say, okay, well, this risk is very low. And we do this all the time in security. We balance risk against the business, and we say, is this risk really probable? Is it going to happen? Do we have the right controls in place to protect against it? If not, then we need to do something about it. If we feel comfortable that our controls are going to hold and we have and the risk is low, then maybe we're not going to do anything about it. And that may have been part of the calculation they did here. But it does come down to, again, asking those basic questions of, what do we have? What happens? What if something goes wrong? What are we going to do? Right? Those are kind of like just the basic questions to ask. In this particular case, it was an example of a real targeted attack, and those are very difficult to defend against. This wasn't, a mass phishing campaign where they just send out, a bunch of emails to a bunch of employees at MGM. They targeted a very specific individual working in MGM. And although not all the details are very clear about, how this happened, because I think some of it is still, you know, not
In the dark.
classified, but, confidential. It just hasn't been,
Yeah.
released. And I think, there's still some, some investigation going on. But it does come down to, what was known publicly is that somebody was targeted with a phishing, attack, which is a voice, phishing, a phone call basically. Um, and they were specifically targeted in this attack, and that's very difficult to try to protect against, because a lot of our security controls that we put in place are, for lack of better terms, for those mass attacks, right? They're for, the persistent, phishing campaigns, the constant port, scanning, the endpoint malware drops, and those kind of things are the things we're looking at it from the technical perspective. But we're not always looking at the individual being targeted type of situation. That's a more complicated type of defense. So.
Okay, so I think in the future we would have to look also potentially at individually what could have been prevented, and actual threat modeling is potentially being the future of cybersecurity, and it helps to the security people to kind of do that as well?
I think, you can, so this is still a threat, right? I mean, and you still have to model that, right? And you need to adjust kind of, and I'm sure MGM obviously is probably doing this now, right? Where they're saying, okay, what happens if one of
No, they
our,
don't.
yeah, what happens if one of our, employees is targeted in an attack and their credentials are compromised? And so I think, we look at threat modeling from the perspective of, not so much, Jane working the front desk, but it's, what happens if a privileged account gets compromised? What are we going to do about that? So that still ties into threat modeling in the sense that, okay, we have these privileged accounts that are across our environment. What happens if one of those privileged accounts falls into the hands of somebody that, shouldn't have access to it? What are we going to do? Um, so I think that that's still, falls within the space of performing that threat model.
Okay, and if you would have to like describe or summarize like the benefits, I would say, of threat modeling, what would it be?
So that comes out, when you let's take this example, the MGM example where, we say an a privileged account has been compromised. And this is where you start talking about what is our isolation, how do we reduce that blast radius? How do we incorporate something like zero trust, where we say, okay, assume everybody within our network is an adversary, right?
Mm.
And honestly, that is kind of the mindset that we all in the security space need to have, is assume that everybody that is in your network or within your system is adversarial, because they may not be today, but they could be tomorrow, whether it's intentional malicious insider or an insider has their credentials compromised. So you take that consideration of like, okay, we have an insider in our system, in our network. They've been compromised. How do we limit that exposure? How do we ensure that that individual, the again, that blast radius is as small as possible?
Okay, very clear for me. And do you think it's very like how can we implement it? I guess in the processes, because security is a lot about processes and working with developers and everything. Kind of is also we pay a lot of attention on how these processes are constructed. So how could we integrate that? Do you think?
Yeah, that's the difficult part because, threat modeling, in product security, application security, we're very accustomed to um, buying a tool, implementing it in the software development lifecycle. We get scan reports out of it. We burn down those reports in the sense that, like, we implement like static analysis. We get 100 vulnerabilities thrown at us a week, and we just burn down those 100 vulnerabilities, in a period of time. That's, we figured that out, right? We know we can argue about how effective that is and whether that's the right approach and all the other stuff, but we figured that out. We figured that process out. From a threat modeling perspective, that's more difficult because to do it correctly, or to do it accurately, you want to make sure that you have the right people involved, that can answer the right questions, and that often involves product people knowledgeable of the product, people knowledgeable of the technology, those that are knowledgeable of the operations of that application. You may need to get, depending on your technology stack, you may need to get like a cloud, specialists in there, and you need security people, right? So you now have this group of individuals, each coming from a different set of disciplines, to really be able to tackle that threat model and say, okay, here are the things that can go wrong. Here's how we're going to correct them. That is very time consuming and it doesn't scale because it's a very people intense type of process. When you look at the tooling perspective, there's plenty of tools out there. There's free ones. OWASP has one called Threat Dragon. Microsoft has one called the Threat Model Tool, I think it's called.
Okay,
And
interesting.
those are free. graphical user interfaces. You drop, blocks on a screen. You draw some, lines between them and say, here's my architecture, my data flow, and it'll spit out a bunch of, threats that you need to protect against. And it'll give you recommendations on how to protect against that. The issue with that is that you come to a point where it feels almost like you're checking a box. Right? You're okay. I create, same way you write code.
Yeah.
I've finished that function. That function is checked in to the branch. It's running in production. We're good. And you kind of get that same mentality with an artifact that you're creating in threat modeling, where you're creating an artifact. It's done. Somebody's reviewed it. You're fine. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean you're actually improving, your security. And so there's automated threat modeling that's been kind of catching fire lately. But it really comes down to the questions that you need to ask at the user story level or at the requirements level, right? Of, hey, we're building this new feature, this new functionality for a client. What can go wrong, right? What happens if, these credentials within this function that we're creating gets compromised? What happens if, somebody is able to view the data, unauthorized, view of the data, or exfiltrate that data, or, corrupt that data? And it's going to vary depending on the organization you work in, the industry you work in. I've worked in healthcare. I've worked in financial space. I've worked in military space. All of them have different types of requirements and different types of concerns that they're worried about. A hospital application that operates in, say, like an emergency room or an operating room, uptime and ensuring that the data is correct is paramount, right? You want to make sure that you have access to the information you need and the information is correct. Whereas a financial institution, they may be more concerned about the confidentiality of their data. So those kind of questions need to be put into the context of the industry and the organization that you work within.
And do you think like all of those different industries, they have also, like as you said, very different problems, but also I guess different compliance regulations, and I guess threat modeling can also help a lot with that?
Yeah, and that's again where I think it means that you have to have the right people involved when you're doing those threat models, right? Because
to the like basically checking the boxes again, like as many people do for compliance.
Right, yeah. And because I think one of the biggest issues is that not everybody's a subject matter expert on everything, right? Security people are very good at knowing like what needs to be, or knowing how to secure something, how to create the architecture, and often how to break into things, right? That's what they think of, right? Compliance people are always thinking about, well, here's the impacts of this data, being breached, from a business perspective, right? We have fines, we have contracts that we may be in breach of, and things like that. And the business people are going to know, or the product people are going to know, what are the impacts to the clients, right? So I think that's why it's important to get that view from different angles of different individuals to really get a holistic view of that threat model.
Yeah, and so once you decide to integrate like threat modeling in your organization, so you mentioned different methods already, like automated threat modeling, manual threat modeling. You have some tools that help with like a nice graphical UI. So if we were like tomorrow, like for instance today, like we have people listening to us that want to start their threat modeling journey, what do you advise them, like where to start exactly in practice?
It's not going to be a fun answer, but the best way to start is honestly the manual approach, right? Because you need to know. I think you need to know the ins and outs of threat modeling, right? You need to know how to build a threat model. I mean, that's true even if you look at development, right? Before you automate something, do it manually first, right? So that you know that here's how it works, here's the connection points, here's the ins and outs and all that stuff, then automate it. And I think that's true for those trying to get started in their threat modeling journey is what does it take to create a threat model? What are those inputs, outputs? What are my expectations? Understand the different types of methodologies that are out there, and then start leaning on an automated tool. Now you can use a graphical tool to help you, something like Threat Dragon or Microsoft's threat model tool, to help you kind of understand how the architecture aligns with threats. But it's good to really get your hands kind of dirty on basic threat modeling before you get into something that's
Yeah.
going to offload it for you, right?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, like there are many standards like Stride, Dread, Pasta, like the meter attack matrix that are related to threat modeling. Are those good for getting started? Like, do they give like real insights, or is it like for more advanced power users of power threat modelers?
I think it depends.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of so I the reason I'm
That's a
hesitating
tough
is because
question.
the reason I'm hesitating is that there's a lot of and I'm guilty of this as well, is teaching about Stride and Dread and Pasta and Trike and some of the other ones out there, because it's a good way to kind of frame the threats. And each one of those has a different type of application, in the sense that each one is used in a different way. Stride is by far probably the most well known. Doesn't make it right, but it's the most well known, right? And it's a way to really categorize the threats that can occur, and that's great to say, we're going to utilize Stride to do this threat model. What does that mean? Because does that mean that if you identify a threat that doesn't fall into one of those categories of spoofing, tampering, repudiation, and so forth, if it doesn't fall into that category, does that mean it doesn't exist, right? And so I think you get into this mentality of like, well, kind of going back to that, like I mentioned before, with the check the box activity with the threat model. It's saying like, hey, I created it, it's done. You can fall into those same kind of traps with things like following a very specific threat modeling methodology to say, okay, well, it doesn't fall cleanly into this methodology that we're using, so therefore do we worry about it? And again, threat modeling, and we do this on a daily basis, and I talk about this in my class when I'm teaching students, is about, we do threat modeling on a daily basis, whether we know it or not, right? We think about that when we're walking to our car, right, to get into the car, while we're out, shopping, or while we're, going out for a run or something like that. I mean, we're constantly in our minds, threat modeling. We're not following a process. We're just thinking about like, hey, what can go wrong if I'm, doing this? And so I think it's a mentality shift. I think those frameworks help people, focus in on certain aspects of threat modeling, but threat modeling is more than following a framework. It's a mindset shift.
Yeah, exactly. Especially because like thinking out of the box is one of the main aspects of threat modeling, right? You want
Right.
to anticipate where you will be attacked and where there are problems, like not following the rules.
So several. I'll give you kind of a quick example. It's kind of a silly example, but several years ago, I went to a threat modeling course. It wasn't a course, but it was a conference on threat modeling. This was 10 years ago. But the gentleman that was teaching the class gave the example that he worked in cybersecurity just like everybody else that was in the room, and he said he went to a hotel. He was in his hotel room, and in the hotel room they had the pumps in the shower for like shampoo and body
Okay.
wash and things like that. So they had the containers with the with the dispensers in the shower for shampoo and conditioner and body wash. I don't need the shampoo, so it's fine. But he went down he went down to the front desk and he asked the front desk person, he said, what if somebody replaced that shampoo with hair removal? And the person at the front desk was like, why would anybody do that? And he's like, I don't know, I'm just asking. Like, there's no control in that, right? Somebody could just pour like hair removal in that, and the next person that goes in there suddenly looks like me. And
I will never
it's
go in a hotel room again.
it's but I mean, that it was a very silly example, but it's that mentality, that mindset shift, right? Of thinking like, look at this, look at this thing that I'm, sitting in front of. What can go wrong? And you start playing those things out in your head, and it's like, yeah, somebody could do that, and then you ask the question,
The
what do we?
anxiety levels. What is
Yeah, yes, exactly. But and then you start asking yourself like, well, what can we do about it? Well, we can put little locks on each one of these, and give the key to the cleaning individual people or whatever. But it's like, okay, well, is that really worth it, right? This risk is so low. That's going to be costly for us to do that. It's going to have operational impacts, and again, that's kind of a silly example, but it that's the mentality shift, right? That doesn't follow stride or dread or posture or any of those other things. It's just, I'm thinking about how this can be broken and how this can go wrong, and what am I going to do about it?
Yeah, but you still have like to in sort of like calculate the ROI of doing something, because sometimes there is a risk, but it's very acceptable compared to the cost of fixing this, right? Like in the case of the shampoo, for instance, like putting locks on every shampoo bottle in all the hotel rooms, not necessarily like necessary compared to the risk.
Right.
Do you think like it's the same, like to do threat modeling right in like the context of a company or an organization? How do you avoid doing like over threat modeling, like doing it too much?
You mean like from the identifying of
Yes.
threats? Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah, and this is another kind of area where when I talk about threat modeling, the common phrase is that your threat model is never truly done, right? Because the thing is that your system changes the moment it goes into production. Let's say you're creating an application, the moment that goes into production, you're working on the next thing, right? Or you're getting feedback about maybe something not working or something needs to be changed. So it's a constant, you're in this DevOps type of environment, right? Where it's a constant set of changes. And so the days of when your application would be released maybe once every 6 months, or and an occasional hotfix goes out, maybe every month or every 2 weeks or something like that. Those days are long gone, right? You have companies that are pushing code into production multiple times a day. So to answer your question, I mean, there is no like end to threat modeling, which gets to the point of tools are not going to be the answer, right? It's you can't expect that somebody's going to fire up Threat Dragon every time there's a code change to change their threat model. Sometimes we ask that, and it depends on the size of the organization. But if you're working in an organization with tens of thousands of developers, that's just not going to happen, right? So it does come back down to, can we do automation? Can we ask basic questions? Can we educate developers and architects and those developing the system to understand what the threats are reflexively, so that they know, like, hey, when I do X, Y could happen, and what am I going to do about that?
So I guess that are the steps that you can take, yeah, how to apply it and how to do it right. And I think the question that comes up, that how to do it, I guess, wrong, or what people shouldn't do, at all, based on your experience, or maybe even have an example like how they shouldn't and mustn't approach when they start.
So I think, one of the most challenging parts of threat modeling is really scope. And what I mean by that is knowing what is part of your system and what isn't part of your system. And I think where, the concept that, the threat model is never done and you're always, going to be threat modeling, well, there's the reason, the reason scope is so important in that equation is that that's a lot of work. So you want to make sure that you're identifying what is it that I can truly control in this threat model. And it's a kind of simplistic way to think about it, but the way I usually talk about it is that if I can't, or if my organization can't alter the code, then that's out of scope for me. Now, there's a difference there in the sense that if it's a system, let's say that I create an application and I'm working with a third party, I'm calling an API or something like that. I can't change the code that the API, that a third party API, is exposing to me. I can't change that code. I can change the data that I'm sending to it or that I'm receiving from it. So that's in scope. But in the sense of can I alter the code of, something that I'm interacting with? If the answer is no, then that's out of scope. So I think knowing what your scope is often a tricky part of threat modeling and where, sometimes that can go wrong. And identifying your assets, knowing what is part of your system, the data, the actual systems, the components, the people, knowing what all that is, that's the hardest part. Once you identify that stuff, then the threat modeling, the pieces kind of fall in place.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So if we take a step back and we think about what's wrong about threat modeling, and especially what's wrong about the current state of threat modeling, what do you think are the current main bottlenecks of the approach? What can we do better?
I think it's a lack of, I don't want to say training, but a lack of knowledge and understanding for individuals that are part of these system development and software development, that we live in an environment and we work in an environment where everything has to be done immediately, right? We are under constant pressure that this has to be done immediately so that you can move on to the next thing, and that has to be done immediately. And so, things that require, I hate to say it, but things that require a little bit more time to think about and time to implement usually kind of fall down the scope a bit, or the ladder a bit, because there's an immediacy to get something out the door. So I think that's one of the bottlenecks is the lack of and again, I hate saying the word train, because I don't think that anyone's true. Yeah, I think it comes down to knowledge, people having that knowledge and understanding, because sending in security people to do threat models is just not scalable. Others have to know, not so much how to create the perfect threat model that you can present at the next threat modeling conference, just the basics, understanding what the risks are, what the threats are, who the threat actors are, understanding just those basic concepts goes a long way. And
so
I think
it's more
there's
like
also
a mindset, in fact.
correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's also, another bottleneck is really, I hate to say it, but trying to understand or trying to get the organization to fall behind a single process of threat modeling. And threat modeling can't, especially in a very large organization, in a small organization that may work, where you say, okay, we're going to use Threat Dragon. Here's the process. Everyone just do it this way. Like, that's great if you're working in an organization with 100 people. If you're working in an organization with, tens of thousands of people, that doesn't necessarily work, right? You can't just say, here is the only option for doing threat modeling is this way, and it's going to follow this process. That gets very challenging. So there has to be some flexibility in the sense of, you know, giving the people the freedom to be able to create the threat model in the way that makes sense for them. Because I think in security, we get so hung up on, on creating these processes that, we can track and we can metrics and we can say, hey, here's how we're doing this. But I think and I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but I think in a lot of cases where, we focus on the process and not on what we're actually trying to do. Like, I think we have to keep on asking ourselves, what is the risk? What are we trying to protect against? And how are we going to do that? And, are we making the organization more secure day over day, right? It doesn't matter how we get there. As long as the organization is becoming more secure on a daily basis, then that's good, right? So I think being a little bit more loose on the process of actually threat modeling and giving more individuals within the organization the ability to produce those threat models are good ways to unblock those bottlenecks.
Mm. And do you think the AI will help each individual to adapt, their process in each organization, or is it actually maybe a threat, to?
So I'm glad we I would think that we can't get through podcasts anymore without talking about AI. So
Yeah,
no,
I mean,
no, I actually I had a conversation about this yesterday around AI and threat modeling, and I think there's so so I don't think AI is there yet, right? I think that the way it is today with generative AI, where you're asking it to produce something and it's going to produce something for you. There's a lot of challenges with that, right? There's the hallucination thing, the poisoning. There's prompt injection, which is just there's a whole set of new challenges with AI. But where I think it can be helpful is, and this is something I'm trying to dive in on, is how can AI help developers write more secure code, or in the case of threat modeling, how can AI help us produce some of those artifacts? And we're not going to get AI to open up Threat Dragon and create a diagram for us and do all that stuff. But there are some examples of using something like Threadgile, which is a way to codify threats and risks and mitigations. And we can go into a generative AI tool and say, hey, here's a threat that I'm thinking about. Can you codify that? And it can then create that JSON for you, and you can use that in your automation when you're creating those Threadgile threat models. So I think that's in the short term maybe some way that we can look at using generative AI by having it create that code for us. Whether it's JSON or YAML, depending on which tool you're using. And just describing a threat, describing a mitigation, or describing your system to it and saying, spit out the code for this so that I can, put that into my my build process so that, the security team's happy that there's an artifact in my build. So I think that's a good short-term way of looking at AI. I think long-term, we've seen AI change so drastically in the past couple weeks, and let alone in the past couple months. I mean, it's changing so rapidly, and I think it's hard to predict where we're going to be 3, 6, 9, 12 months from now. We may be, in a year from now, in a place where, we can dump in a data flow diagram or an architecture and have an AI, model just create the threats for us and spit out a list of mitigations and stuff. We may be there in some time, but who knows?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you this question. If we talk about the future of threat modeling, and I think you kind of answered already, like about what it will be in 10 years. But if we think about AI and everything, and we go in 10 years, we'll just like have to input the diagram of the data flow of the apps, and we'll have like all the threat modeling done ourselves. But I guess also like the existence of AI and the new like technical innovation will bring more threat to applications as well.
Yeah.
So how do you think we will deal with that? Do we have to invent novel ways of doing threat modeling to counter the advance, like the evolution of the threats?
Yeah, I mean, none of us are going to be out of a job anytime soon, I don't think so. I mean, it's like every time,
Yes,
every
no.
time we think I'm old enough to remember, doing security in on-premise, data centers, and it's like that's a whole different model, right? You have I could look out my window and see my data center across the street, and so I know where it is, I know where my data is, I know, all that, and then came cloud, right? And that upended everything where, now, it's a different threat model, right? And then you have containers that come along, and that's a different, set of threats, and then you have now AI and everything in between. And so I think, like anything else, and I was talking to somebody at a networking event a week ago about how I think this is the challenge for security folks is that, I used to be a software engineer. I worked in .NET, C Sharp, but and I dabbled in Java. Like I was not an enterprise software engineer for Java. I was an enterprise software engineer for C Sharp. But stepping into the security space, I need to know Java. I need to know C Sharp. I need to know Python. I need to know Rails and now Rust and R. It's like the whole list goes on. And now I need to know cloud, and not just cloud, but not just AWS, but GCP and Oracle Cloud and so like AI is just another one of those things that kind of get lumped on security, where it's like you guys go figure out how to secure this, and I think that's the challenge for security folks, is that you need to be a jack of all trades and or a Jill of all trades, and know like um, what the implications are from a security perspective on those technology stacks or that technology innovation. But it all comes down, to the same things. It's very easy: confidentiality, integrity, availability. Right? Those are the three things that we talk about all
Yeah.
the time in security. And I think as long as you're putting, those the new innovations, new technology down to those kind of basic principles, you're moving in the right direction. But it's a challenging space, and yeah, I mean, things are going to have to evolve just as technology is evolving.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and thanks for sharing your vision about that. It all comes to like availability, confidentiality, and sorry, what's the last one?
Availability.
Yeah, availability. I have a question for you. We always ask it during the podcast, Derek. Do you have an advice for the younger generation of security professionals, and do you have a book to recommend for them?
Apart from yours.
Yeah, I know one that we could recommend.
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely. You can definitely pick up mine. And so I do get asked frequently about, advice for those like getting into the security space and where they can start and how they can get into it. And there's a lot of challenges with getting into security. I think, a lot of us that are in the security space are looking for more people to get into it. There's plenty of people that want to get into it, but we still kind of have challenges with making those
Mm.
connections. And I think some of it is that we have these requirements for individuals to have a certain set of experience and background and knowledge, and that kind of limits who we can kind of hire. And so I try to tell individuals, what do you number one, security is a big space, right? Cybersecurity is a huge space. I spend a lot of my time in application security, product security, but that's just a niche. There's security analysts, there's information security, there's GRC, there's audit individuals, there's physical security that's tied to cybersecurity. So there's a huge, and in each one of those are subcategories of focus. So I often ask people that ask me that question, well, what are you interested in? What interests you about security? If you want to get into application security or product security, I can certainly help you get there. If you're interested in SOC or information security, then that's a different kind of branch. And so it's important to really know what interests you, because that if you don't like what you're doing, and if you don't wake up in the morning and say, like, I'm looking forward to doing the things that I'm doing, you're going to have challenges, right? I think it's important to really like what you're doing. Like, I look at the people that work in information security, I don't get it. I don't know how you wake up in the morning and say, I love doing information security, because I think it's just so boring, so dry. I know that it's needed, but but they wake up in the morning and they probably say the same thing about me. Like, it's boring, it's dry, but
Never know.
yeah. So, but I think it's important to know like where you want to go within security, and then it's easier to kind of figure out. I don't want to say easier, but then it's you can start connecting the dots on the path to get to that. But I think the biggest thing for especially those that are in security and getting into a more technical space is you really do need to have technical background. It doesn't have to be in security, but if you are going to be somebody that works in application security, you better know how software is developed. If you're going to be in a SOC analyst or somebody that works in security operations, then you do need to know how to identify, ongoing activity, and how to, spot, malicious activity. And if you're going to be a pen tester, show examples of how you've done penetration testing in your labs and things like that. So I think it's one of those catch-22s that they talk about all the time, is that you can go out and get all the certifications that you want. If you don't have experience, oftentimes an organization is not going to hire you. So experience, I think, plays a much bigger part in your journey than certifications. And I often tell individuals that, as they're trying to pursue certain certifications, because that's what they ask. They're like, well, which certification should I go for? It's like, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time chasing certifications, because if you don't have that background or if you don't have that experience, it's going to be hard to justify that certification to an organization. So, that kind of also plays into, can you get some role if you want to be a SOC analyst? And you can't get in because you don't have experience, can you take a help desk role, right? And I know that's not glamorous, and I know that's not what people are looking for in terms of answers, but can you get a help desk type of role to start building that knowledge about how an organization works, how IT works? That'll then get you that experience. You can start chasing your securities or certifications while you're doing that. And the caveat there is oftentimes organizations will help pay for that, right? They'll help send you to, get trained to get your certification. And then you have an opportunity to work on the inside to get into a security role. So again, it's not a great example or a great answer there, but it's more, know what you want to do. Can you get that technology background, under your belt, and that'll help kind of grease the wheels to get you in.
Great. Yeah. So learn about the technology, like get a technology background, and then define precisely what are you chasing, like what is the position of you're dreaming about, and then you can ramp up and learn about it.
Yep.
Nice. And about a book that you could recommend?
I I'm so terrible, because there are so many books out there, and a lot of good ones. And there's a lot of people that that I follow on LinkedIn that have written books that are very good people to
Mm-hmm.
follow. Chris Hughes is one. Tanya Janica is another one. She's written Alice and Bob Learns Application Security.
Yeah.
Matt Rose is another guy that I follow on LinkedIn who's he wrote the foreword on my book. So like unfortunately, as much as I do really love reading, like I usually am have a book in hand. I just have not had time to get caught up on a lot of reading lately. It's been a lot of LinkedIn reading instead.
Yeah,
So I
of
tend to
course.
follow individuals. And so I'll have to pass on the recommendation just because I can't
It's
justify a recommendation if I haven't read it recently. So
it's okay. You actually gave us the names of really good people, great people in cybersecurity that have a lot of interesting insights. On my side, I have read your book, Derek, the Application Security Program Handbook. I really recommend everyone to read it. It's very insightful, and especially it goes from a very high level thoughts on the security up until the details, down to the details, and I really enjoyed that. So I recommend the people listening to us to read it.
I appreciate that.
Thank you, Derek. It was incredible to have you today as a guest, and it was a really nice deep dive into threat modeling. So I really appreciate that you shared your insight with us.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for being